In this video, I'll be going over some basic inking techniques for manga and comics. I'm Kai, an 18-year-old artist from the UK, currently working on a one-shot with Viz. We'll start with some basic inking techniques such as hatching, and then we'll move on to more complex things. I'll only be talking about shonen inking because I'm not used to inking shoujos or anything like that. I'll also answer some questions at the end of the video. First, I'm going to go over some settings that you might need for when you work on your projects. More specifically, this toolbar here, you don't have to worry about the canvas size or anything. What's more important here is basic expression color here, and it should be set to monochrome typically. Monochrome allows it to be, when you draw a line, it's going to be a lot more crisp than if you do it with a colored layer. Because color or gray, because when you use color or gray, it allows for the full expression of the grays in between black and white. With monochrome, it's solely just black and white, so it's like the lines are going to be super crisp. Let me show you an example. Here's a line that's drawn with monochrome versus a line that's drawn with color, and you'll notice that this one blurs out a lot, and this is the colored one, so it's better to use the monochrome one, and that's going to make your drawings look a lot more crisp. Of course, you can still use the colored one if you like, but it does sometimes, if you draw a thicker line, it's going to make your stuff a lot more blurry on the outside. If you want to get that crisp line that a lot of new gen manga have, it's better to use monochrome in my opinion. Now I'm going to go quickly over the pens that you can use. Me personally, I use the standard G pen tool that's built in with Clip Studio. So I just use, but you can use any pen that allows for line variation. Essentially, line variation is just allowing your lines to go from thick to thin, like so. You know, tools that you don't want to use is something like a felt tip pen, because it's very the line is the same length throughout, and this can make your lines look very boring. Unless it's a certain style you're trying to go for. There are specific mangakas that don't use line variation, and if you're going for that, then ignore this completely. But if you're going for a typical standard shonen series, typically they have line variation, so I would do that. In addition, with line variation, you can put things in the foreground and it'll look thicker like this. So this is a thicker line, and then we put a thinner line back here. And notice how it looks like this one is in the foreground, in other words closer to the camera, while this one looks like it's much further away. And you can really sell this illusion when you start adding things and overlapping things, and then it makes like the sort of panel or scene that you're drawing has a lot more depth. Since we're over that, we'll go over some basic examples of what to do when inking. We'll start with the most basic, which is basic form of adding detail, which is hatching. Essentially with hatching, you probably noticed, and you've seen them in manga if you've read them, it's basically just lines that add detail into specific parts of artworks. So they might be lines like this. Essentially, when you draw hatching, you want to keep it super consistent, and you don't want to make it you know, messy, unless it's the style you're going for. But typically you're going to want your hatching to be super clean and clear cut. Here I've drawn some sketches. Naturally they're very loose, because when you draw too detailed sketches, you actually end up just tracing it in terms of when you're adding the lines. For example, if you're one of those people who say my sketch looks better than my line art or inks, it's typically because you're spending a lot more time on the sketch than you are on the inks, which is, you know, not the way to go about it. Typically you want to put down as little as possible in the sketch, just to get an idea of what's going to happen. You put down your basic shapes, where the lighting's going to go, things like that, and you keep it very basic, and then when you get to the inks, you add all the detail there. When you do too detailed a sketch, you actually end up trying to replicate that in the line art phase, and it feels very stiff. You want it to feel authentic when you draw the lines, and make it feel like, you know, the lines have energy. Comic artists are a little different, or if you're working for a company, typically you do have to draw more complex sketches, simply because you're usually working for a team, so you won't be inking it yourself. In that sense, it is different, so something to keep in mind. Here are some examples of different inks that I've drawn out. As you can see, this one in the top left here is when you're just tracing the lines, and typically this is not what you want to do unless you're trying to achieve a very specific style, which is sort of the Chainsaw Man type style where there's no line variation. It's really, you know, a pretty ugly style. And if that's what you're trying to achieve, then I'd say do that, or at least the most recent Chainsaw Mans. This one here would be more standard typical shonen, which is sort of thick outlines and sort of thinner inside details. Essentially, with these thick outlines, you can either do line variation or you don't really have to do line variation at all. Essentially, there's not really a hard and fast rule on this. It depends on the style you're trying to emulate, because some mangaka, Akira Toriyama, he uses line variation when he does the outlines, but someone like the guy from Naruto, he will use no line variation at all. So that's something to keep in mind too. With this one up here, this one is actually when the lines are affected by the lighting scenario, and I think this is typically something that's in comics rather than manga itself. As you can see, the light source is coming from up here, so the lines that are closest to the light and facing the light are affected by it, and they're a lot thinner than the lines that are facing away, which are a lot darker and more dense, as you can see over here too. Naturally, this typically won't affect things like the eyes, just because eyes are always going to be thick in sort of manga and comics, but it will affect stuff like hatching and the way you draw that. I mean, I think a good example might be Berserk. With the way the hatching is in Berserk, very much is affected by the lighting scenario that the characters are in. This one down here is more like important sort of details are thicker than other parts, and things like the face outlines are a lot thicker than other parts. The general idea here is that you put thick and thin wherever you sort of feel like it, and wherever the contrast needs it, because when you're drawing a manga page, typically you want a certain amount of contrast, which is, you know, a certain amount of black versus white on the page, and how thick and thin you draw the lines can really affect that. With these ones, it doesn't have to be only one of them. You can sort of mix your line art styles together and come up with something yourself. That's typically what a lot of manga do anyway, you know. So what I'm going to talk about now is Screetones versus Hatching. Typically they can be used like in similar places, for example on clothes and things like that. All that really matters is that you're using enough black shades on your characters. For example here, we'll use this again. I'll get rid of the hatching here real quick. I'll probably skip through this. And here is that without the hatching on it. And essentially I've replaced the hatching with Screetones. Typically with certain shades of color, you want to use gradients rather than, you know, plain Screetone. So here I'll just use a gradient, and we'll see how that looks. This is how the same image might look with Screetone, but the general idea is when you use Screetone, you kind of have to use hatching anyway. So you can put down some hatching here, so it's not as harsh when it turns to gray tones. Naturally, you don't always have to do this. Some mangaka just won't do it, and if you're going for a specific style, of course, you don't need to do it. But typically, it is, you know, done when you add an extra hatching like this. Maybe even extra black to balance things out a bit more, like so. But truly, it depends on the style that you're trying to emulate when it comes to sort of hatching or screen toning. You can actually use a white pen to go back over the artworks and make them look more detailed than they actually are. You know, you can draw lines through them like I've already done here, like so. You can make dots. A lot of mangas do this. You can make dots throughout the drawing, and it makes the contrast a lot nicer, like so. It adds a lot more flavor to the drawing. You can also go back over these hatching lines with these lighter sort of colors, and it will make your inks look a lot better too. Basically, the inking is the stage that you want to put the most time into, I think. Because this is going to be what people see at the end of the day, you want to put as much detail into it as you can. Or maybe not even as much detail, because some people don't go for detailed styles, but like, you want to put, you know, whatever your goal is, really nail down on it in the inking phase. Whatever mistakes you make in the sketch phase, you can correct in the inking phase anyway. I'm going to go over some basic mistakes that people make. Typically, when it comes to hatching and screen toning, you want to put down enough black so that it doesn't feel flat or plain, because typically what a lot of beginners will do is they'll make their stuff feel flat with like the way that they place on their screen tones, because there won't be enough black to really define the form, or enough hatching to sort of go over the form. For example, when they're screen toning or hatching, they might just do this. Like so. And you'll have a flat shade like this. When in reality, I think whether you use hatching or screen tone for these inks, you want to put down enough sort of ink so that your drawing don't feel flat. The blacks and hatching specifically are here to really define the form of the sort of object, whatever you're drawing, whether it be a character or a car, you know, whatever. You want your blacks to define, you know, the sort of form. So essentially, if I was going to define this form, you kind of get the hang of this when you look at more manga and read them. I'd recommend Dandadan if you want to get into drawing blacks. Because they draw a lot of blacks because of the school uniforms and things like that, and you can learn how to define the forms in terms of, you know, their anatomy and things like that. It's going to be a lot easier to do that. And typically it can be good to put down like 50% black into your sort of characters. I learned that from Inky Nimbus. He's a Instagram artist, and it's something that's cool to do. So essentially like this, you can put down enough black that, I mean, naturally the drawing was already flat, so, but this looks a lot better, and it will especially look a lot better on your manga drawings when you put a lot of effort into them. So it's important to put down enough black so that your drawings don't look flat, essentially. Another common beginner mistake I'd say is not using enough line variation. Line variation is sort of like, it can be a stylistic choice, but at the same time it's only a stylistic choice if you're choosing to make it a stylistic choice. For a lot of beginners, they just naturally do that. They naturally just don't use any line variation. So I would highly suggest you know, finding a way to use line variation in your work. You know, using reference on mangas that do have a lot of line variation. You know, mangas like Rent a Girlfriend have a lot of line variation in their drawing. And once you learn how to, you know, sort of vary your lines, you can choose to do it without line variation. I think it's better if it's a choice and not something that you're forced into because you don't have the skill to do it any other way. Now we'll go on to the Instagram comments, the questions that people had. Somebody asked what my process was, and it's mostly just when I'm personally inking, I'm thinking about contrast a lot rather than logistics as to, you know, where the light is coming from and things like that, unless there's a specific reason why I would need to think about the lighting. For example, if there's an explosion, I would want to make the lines that are thinner, closer to the explosion, and the lines that are thicker further away, naturally. But typically I'm just thinking about contrast and what looks the best. Here's some of my inks that I'm currently doing. Essentially there's no really rhyme or reason to the way I personally draw my lines. I prefer thinner lines for details, and more big swooping lines for fabric and clothes and things like that. But yeah, that's basically my process, and that's the end of the video too. So like, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Peace.